Not every bloodline ends in death. Some are erased while still breathing. History often counts bodies, but rarely counts identities lost. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a silent system operated across continents not to kill people, but to unmake them. In places like the United States and Canada, governments and religious institutions built what they called boarding schools. Their purpose was not education alone, but transformation. Indigenous children Navajo, Lakota, Cherokee, Cree were taken from their families, sometimes by force, sometimes under pressure, sometimes under the promise of opportunity. But once they crossed those school gates, something irreversible began. Their hair cut, their language banned, their names replaced. A child who once carried generations in their name would suddenly answer to something foreign, something easier to control, something easier to erase. This was not random. It was a policy. In the United States, officials like Richard Henry Pratt openly declared the mission: kill the Indian, save the man. Not with bullets, but with identity removal. Culture was seen as a problem to be corrected, tradition, something to be erased, and it worked faster than anyone expected. Within one generation, children returned home unable to speak to their own parents. Stories could no longer be passed down. Songs went silent. Sacred knowledge broken in transmission. Then came the deeper fracture. Many never returned at all. Some died in these institutions, buried in unmarked graves, their families never informed. Others survived, but could no longer find their place in either world. Not fully accepted by the system that reshaped them, and no longer fully connected to the communities they came from. This is how a bloodline disappears without a single war being declared. No battlefield, no headlines, just silence. Entire family lines lost not through death but through disconnection, through forced forgetting, through deliberate rewriting of identity. And this wasn't limited to one region. Similar systems appeared in Australia, where Aboriginal children became known as the stolen generations, and in parts of Africa under colonial rule, where names, languages, and belief systems were systematically replaced. The method was always the same. Take the children, and you take the future. Today, many are still searching using DNA, oral history, and fragments of memory to reconnect what was broken, to find names that were buried, to restore identities that were never meant to survive. Because the truth is this: they didn't disappear, they were erased. And what was erased is now fighting to be remembered. This wasn't accidental. It didn't happen in chaos. It happened in offices, in classrooms, in laws written with intent. Across continents, systems were carefully constructed to erase identity not by killing bodies, but by dismantling memory. In the United States and Canada, Indigenous children were taken into residential and boarding school systems designed to reform them. In Australia, the stolen generations saw Aboriginal children removed from their families under government policy. In parts of Africa, during colonial rule, mission schools and administrative systems replaced local identities with European ones, reshaping names, beliefs, and social structures. Different locations, same blueprint. The process always began with separation. Children were removed sometimes by force, sometimes through coercion, sometimes under the claim of education. But once taken, the goal was clear: break the chain between past and future. Inside these institutions, identity became a target. Names were the first to go. Indigenous names rich with meaning, lineage, and history were replaced with foreign ones easier to record, easier to control. A child who could not recognize their own name was already one step removed from their origin. Then came language. Native tongues were banned. Speaking them could result in punishment, physical, emotional, or both. Language carries memory, stories, and a worldview. Remove the language, and you begin to erase the way people understand themselves. Culture followed. Traditional clothing was replaced with uniforms. Hairstyles were cut to standard. Spiritual practices were labeled primitive or illegal. Songs were silenced. Rituals were forbidden. The intention was not integration, it was substitution, and it was enforced with precision. Records were kept, names documented, altered, archived. Identities reduced to files. The system did not forget, it rewrote. Parents were left behind in silence. Many never saw their children again. Others did, but the children who returned were no longer the same. They could not speak their parents' language. They did not recognize their customs. In some cases, they felt shame toward their own origins. That is how erasure works, not through a single act but through repetition. Policy after policy, year after year, generation after generation. Key point: this was not war. There were no battlefields. No headlines of mass death. This was designed for assimilation, a controlled, methodical process aimed at one outcome: a future where identity is diluted, disconnected, and eventually forgotten. Because when you erase the name, you don't just change a person, you control what comes next. They were told they would return. That was the promise given to parents, sometimes gently, sometimes under pressure. Education, opportunity, a better future. But for many families, that promise became a permanent silence, because most never came back. Across institutional systems, boarding schools, mission houses, state-run facilities, children were taken at very young ages, often before memory could fully form. At that stage, identity is still being built, and that made them easier to reshape. Inside, life followed strict order: rows of beds, cold mornings, regulated movement, discipline over comfort. The environment was not designed to nurture, it was designed to control. Personal identity had no place in a system built on uniformity. And then came the breaking point: language. For many of these children, their native tongue was the last remaining connection to home. It carried their mother's voice, their community's stories, their sense of belonging. But inside these institutions, speaking that language was forbidden. Punishments were immediate. A word spoken in the wrong tongue could lead to isolation, physical discipline, or public humiliation. Over time, fear replaced familiarity. Children stopped speaking not because they forgot at first, but because they learned it was safer not to remember. And slowly, the silence settled in. Names faded next. Without language, names lose meaning. Without meaning, identity weakens. Many children began to respond only to the names given to their names that had no connection to their bloodline, no link to their ancestry. Then came something deeper than discipline: confusion. Imagine looking into a mirror and not recognizing the person staring back, not physically, but internally. Not knowing where you belong, not fully understanding who you are. Caught between two worlds, accepted by neither. This was the reality for many. When some eventually returned years later, they often found themselves strangers in their own homes. They could not communicate with their parents. They did not understand cultural practices. In some cases, they felt disconnected, even ashamed, and many never returned at all. Some remained within the system into adulthood. Others disappeared into new societies, carrying fragments of identities they could no longer piece together. Their children inherited that disconnection, growing up without a clear sense of origin. Key insight: this is how a bloodline can end without death. Not through extinction, but through interruption. When a person forgets their real name, when they lose their language, when they cannot pass down who they are, the lineage doesn't continue as it should. It stops, not visibly, not suddenly, but completely. And in that silence, entire histories are lost. Not because they were destroyed, but because no one was left who could remember them. A bloodline doesn't only end when people die. It ends when identity is lost. Because a lineage is more than biology. It is memory carried forward, names spoken across generations, languages passed from parent to child, traditions repeated until they become identity itself. When that chain is broken, the loss is not always visible, but it is permanent. Across systems of forced assimilation, the damage did not stop with the children who were taken. It extended into the generations that followed, quietly, consistently, and often without recognition. When a child grows up without their original language, they cannot teach it. When they are disconnected from their cultural practices, they cannot pass them down. When their name has been changed, their lineage becomes harder to trace, sometimes impossible. And so, the break begins. Family trees that once held centuries of history begin to collapse. names disappear, connections fade, entire branches are reduced to a single unknown point in time where records stop, and memory fails. In many cases, documentation exists, but it tells an incomplete story. Official records may show assigned names, institutional placements, or dates of transfer. But they rarely preserve identity. They record presence, not belonging. This creates a gap that cannot easily be repaired. Descendants, generations later, begin searching. They look through archives. They take DNA tests. They follow fragments, partial names, unclear origins, and distant matches. But what they are trying to recover is not just information. It is a connection, and connections cannot always be reconstructed from data. Because what was lost was not only written, it was lived. A grandmother's language never learned. A father's true name never spoken. A cultural practice never passed down. These are not just missing details, they are missing links in the chain of identity. Core message: the disappearance was both genetic and cultural. Not in the sense that people vanished, but in the sense that continuity was interrupted. The line did not end in death. It ended in disconnection. And that distinction matters. Because when a lineage is broken this way, its absence is harder to see but deeper to feel. It shows up in questions without answers, in identities that feel incomplete, in histories that begin too late, with no clear origin. Yet even in that loss, something remains. The instinct to search, the desire to understand, the need to reconnect. These are echoes of what was taken but not entirely erased. Because while a broken lineage cannot be fully restored, it can still be remembered. And in that remembrance, fragments of identity begin to take shape again. Not as they once were, but as proof that they existed at all, and that they mattered. Some of them are still alive today, not in the past, not in history books, but in cities, towns, and communities living ordinary lives, carrying extraordinary origins they may never have been told. Because when identity is altered, it doesn't disappear completely. It adapts, it hides, it continues, unrecognized. Across generations shaped by forced assimilation, many descendants grew up with names, languages, and cultural identities assigned to them, identities that did not fully reflect their origins. Over time, those assigned identities became normal, accepted, passed down, and the original story faded into the background. But it didn't vanish. It remained in fragments, unspoken, undocumented, and often unknown even to those who carried it. Today, something is changing. DNA analysis is beginning to uncover what historical systems attempted to erase. Individuals who believed they belonged entirely to one background are discovering genetic links to communities, regions, and lineages they were never told about. These discoveries are not rare. They are becoming patterns. People are finding connections to indigenous groups, distant tribes, and ancestral lines that do not match their recorded history. In many cases, the paper trail ends but the biological trace continues. This creates a new kind of awareness, not based on memory but on evidence. Connection to channel theme. DNA is now uncovering what history tried to erase. But the discovery is only the beginning, because knowing where you come from is not the same as understanding it. A DNA result can point to a place, a people, a possibility, but it cannot restore the language that was lost, the traditions that were never taught, or the names that were changed. It reveals existence, not experience. And yet, even that matters, because it confirms something powerful. The bloodline did not disappear. It survived, hidden within modern identities, blended into populations, carried forward without recognition. Generations moved forward without knowing the full story, but the connection remained, encoded beneath the surface. In some cases, people began to reconnect, learning, researching, rebuilding fragments of what was lost. In others, the discovery raises more questions than answers. But the silence is no longer complete. Faces today carry echoes of the past. Features, expressions, and even instincts can reflect histories that were never formally passed down. Entire lineages exist within individuals who were never told their place in them. And that is what makes this moment different. For the first time, technology is exposing what systems tried to conceal, not through memory, but through biology. The bloodline is still here, not fully visible, not fully understood, but present, and waiting to be recognized. To control a people, you don't always have to destroy them physically. You erase their past. History shows that power is not only enforced through force, it is maintained through structure. And one of the most effective structures ever used was identity control. Across different regions and time periods, systems of assimilation were not random acts of cultural pressure. They were deliberate strategies tied to governance, land, and authority. Because when people lose connection to who they are, their ability to resist, organize, and claim ownership becomes weaker. It begins with land. Land is not just territory, it is tied to identity, ancestry, and belonging. When communities are disconnected from their cultural roots, their historical claim to land becomes harder to defend. Without clear lineage, documented identity, or preserved tradition, ownership can be challenged, redefined, or taken. So the process was designed to weaken that connection. Maps were redrawn. Boundaries were redefined. Indigenous territories were renamed, reorganized, and absorbed into new systems of control. But physical control of land was only one part of the strategy. The deeper control was psychological. Cultural symbols, language, dress, rituals were not just traditions. They were markers of identity. Removing them was not about modernization. It was about replacement. When a person no longer identifies with their origin, they are more likely to adopt the identity of the system in control. That shift changes everything. A population that once saw itself as distinct, connected, and rooted begins to see itself differently, fragmented, disconnected, and dependent. Over time, resistance weakens not because people are incapable, but because the foundation of unity has been altered. This is how power stabilizes itself, not through constant force, but through long-term influence. Authorities enforced uniform identity because uniformity is easier to manage. A population that shares the same imposed language, structure, and worldview is more predictable, more controllable, less likely to challenge the system that defines it. Historical truth. Identity loss was a tool of control. It reduced resistance without open conflict. It allowed systems to expand influence while appearing structured and justified. And because it operated over time through education, policy, and social pressure, it often went unrecognized for what it truly was. But the impact remains. It can be seen in altered histories, in disputed identities, in communities still working to reconnect with what was interrupted. The effects are not confined to the past, they continue to shape present realities. Because when identity is removed, something critical is lost. The ability to stand firmly on origin. And without that foundation, control becomes easier to maintain. Not by force, but by design. Now, the lost generation is being rediscovered. Not through a single event, but through a gradual shift, one driven by technology, awareness, and a growing desire to reconnect with what was once taken. For decades, many lived with unanswered questions about their origins, names that didn't trace back, histories that began too recently, identities that felt incomplete. But today, that silence is being challenged. DNA ancestry has become one of the most powerful tools in this process. People who once had no clear link to their past are now uncovering connections to regions, tribes, and communities that were never part of their recorded history. These discoveries are not just scientific, they are deeply personal. They confirm that something existed before the gap. And for many, that confirmation is enough to begin the journey back. But rediscovery is not only happening in laboratories. It is happening in communities. Across different parts of the world, cultural revival efforts are taking shape. Languages once suppressed are being taught again. Traditional ceremonies are being practiced openly. Names that were changed are being reclaimed, sometimes formally, sometimes symbolically. This is not about returning to the past exactly as it was. It is about restoring continuity. Because even when knowledge is incomplete, the act of reclaiming identity begins to rebuild what was interrupted. It creates a bridge, imperfect, but necessary, between generations. And that bridge is changing lives. Individuals are meeting distant relatives for the first time. Communities are reconnecting across borders. Stories that were once hidden are being told again, not as fragments, but as shared history. Powerful shift. The erased are beginning to remember, not always through direct memory, but through reconstruction, research, and recognition. Through the decision to seek, to question, and to reconnect. This moment is different from the past, because for the first time, the tools to uncover hidden identity are widely accessible. Information that was once controlled or buried can now be explored. Connections that were once impossible to trace are now within reach. But the process is not simple. Reclaiming identity requires more than discovery. It requires understanding, respect, and time. It involves learning histories that were not taught, rebuilding connections that were broken, and accepting that some parts may never be fully recovered. Yet even with those limits, something important is happening. A shift from silence to awareness, from disconnection to pursuit, from absence to recognition. The lost generation is not completely lost anymore. They are finding their way back, step by step, name by name, story by story. And in that process, something once erased is beginning to take shape again. A generation was lost, not because they died, but because they were forgotten. History often remembers what can be counted events, dates, outcomes. But it struggles to preserve what cannot be easily recorded: identity, memory, and belonging. And in that gap, entire lineages have slipped away without recognition. Because what was taken was not always physical. It was continuity. Across assimilation systems, the most lasting damage was not immediate, it was generational. When a child loses their language, they lose the ability to pass it on. When their name was changed, their connection to ancestry became harder to trace. When cultural practices were removed, the rhythm of identity repeated across generations was interrupted. And when that interruption happens, history does not end loudly. It fades. A family line that once stretched back centuries can narrow to a single point where records become unclear, where memory no longer reaches, where origin is no longer certain. From that point forward, everything that follows is disconnected from what came before. This is how disappearance can exist without visibility. No headlines, no clear moment of loss, just a gradual erasure of connection. And the deeper truth is this: many of these stories were never fully documented. Records focused on administration, not identity. Names were written down, but meanings were not. Movements were tracked, but belonging was not preserved. So the question remains: how many bloodlines disappeared without the world ever noticing? How many histories ended in silence, not because they lacked value, but because they were never given the chance to continue? Yet even within that loss, something persists. Fragments remain in records, in distant memories, in the quiet recognition that something is missing. Today, more people are beginning to ask questions, to search, to reconnect. Not to fully restore what was lost that may not be possible, but to acknowledge that it existed. And that matters, because remembrance is the first step toward preservation. It ensures that what was once erased is no longer ignored. It gives weight to stories that were overlooked and restored visibility to histories that were nearly forgotten. The past cannot be rewritten, but it can be recognized. And in that recognition, something changes, not just in how history is understood, but in how it is carried forward. Final call to action. If this story moved you, subscribe, like, comment, and share. Because history like this must never be erased again.